The hatch slammed open with the tired groan of iron, and sun poured in like a verdict. Wilhelm Krauss, 24, a tank gunner who had watched dunes burn in Tunisia, blinked hard as the Statue of Liberty slid past the transport's rail. He had rehearsed this moment for weeks: the boots, the rifle butts, the public spitting. Older men behind him muttered the catechism of the condemned. Keep your chin up, don't beg, save your breath for the march. But the dock they stepped onto was orderly, almost indifferent. No jeers, no theater. An American sergeant, square-jawed, tobacco tucked in his cheek, counted heads in a flat Midwestern drawl, as if he were unloading sacks of wheat, not prisoners of Hitler's army. Wilhelm's ears filled with unfamiliar sounds. The slap of ferry wakes against pilings, a gull's cry clean as glass, the unembarrassed hum of a city that had never learned darkness. Manhattan rose beyond the water, windows glittering like coins in a shaken hand. Back home, the streets of Hamburg were blacked out, curtains pinned, candles smothered at the knock of the air raid warden. Here the skyline was a confession of power. We can afford to be seen. He wrote a line into the pocket diary he had smuggled past Tunis and Bizerte, the same thin book that had absorbed dust, fear, and the slow hunger of retreat. If this is a country at war, then we understood nothing. Beside him, Sergeant Otto Vogel, the schoolmaster from Bremen, whose voice could still make a room go quiet, squinted at a billboard advertising a movie. No one paints posters if they expect bombs by night, he said, not entirely to Wilhelm. They were not herded into cattle cars. The train west was of plain wood and steel, but it was clean, windows latched, the benches honest in their hardness. An American MP, named Earl Bennett, who looked to Wilhelm's surprise, like a farmer, more than a soldier, walked the aisle, tapping a tally stick against his leg, speaking in the patient, unthreatening cadence men use with horses. Through the glass, the country unrolled in tidy chapters: marshes, row houses, steel trestles, shouldering rail after rail. Freight trains hammered past with such frequency that Vogel lost count. Listen, he said softly as a string of coal cars thundered by. That is the sound of a war decided on tracks. Somewhere in Pennsylvania. The train paused at a junction, and another stream of cars slid alongside flatbeds, stacked with tractors, boxcars stenciled with numbers that meant nothing to them and everything to the men who scheduled such tides. Wilhelm pressed his forehead to the window. Back in North Africa, Rommel had taught them to measure the future in liters of fuel and meters of hose. Here it seemed the yardmasters measured in continents. He imagined, unbidden, the map table in Berlin, the pins and strings, and felt a brief, shameful thrill at the precision of this enemy's choreography. The first station they stepped through in the Midwest was not hostile, not welcoming, either more curious than anything. Children counted buttons on Feldgrau tunics. A woman with a basket of eggs stared, then adjusted her shawl and turned away. What stunned Wilhelm were the shop windows. Shoes lined up like soldiers on parade. Oranges nested in pyramids of color, so reckless they felt obscene. He thought of his mother in Stuttgart, ration card jittering in her fingers as she waited for margarine. He looked up at a barber pole, lazily spinning electricity to spare on a sign, then down at his own boots, dusty from more than one continent. The camp in Iowa did have barbed wire and towers, and the first bite of dread returned when the truck rolled past the gate and the wire sang its soft metal song. But the barracks were set in neat rows, windows cut square for air, a canteen's light hanging like a tame moon. That night, the sound that carried to Wilhelm's bunk wasn't a scream or the authoritative bark of a truncheon. It was a phonograph in the guard room, a clarinet climbing a staircase made of brass. He lay awake, the smell of old wood and clean hay rising from the boards, and wrote by the weak electric bulb. They promised the bullet. Instead there is light. Morning broke with the bakery smell of something he had decided, for prudence, not to expect. The mess hall was long tables, dented metal trays, the authoritative steam of food that had crossed no submarine-haunted sea to get here. Meat, actual meat, exhaled its comfort. Milk stood white in pitchers. Apples, their skins freckled, waited in big bowls. The first clatter of forks sounded wrong to him, like laughter at a funeral. Vogel stared at a heel of bread and said, in a voice for the classroom, "One meal here would feed my daughters for 2 days." He didn't lift his eyes when he said it. Wilhelm took a bite with care, as if the act might trigger a trap. Butter loosened across his tongue. Potatoes gave way without argument. He felt the faint panic of a man who has been starving long enough to fear what fullness might demand in return. Around him, men who had fought over a single orange peel in Africa now debated whether to ask for seconds. The guard Bennett noticed and pretended not to. Wilhelm thought of the slogans in Berlin: soil and blood, peasant strength, and saw, not for the first time, how easily words spoiled when set beside the ordinary evidence of a well-run kitchen. After lunch, the Americans handed out cigarettes. Lucky Strikes. The Red Bulls. I so jaunty, it felt like mockery. Vogel coughed on his first drag and laughed until tears rolled, smoke and something older coming out together. Wilhelm held his own cigarette like a question. The ember glowed, a tiny sunrise held between finger and thumb. He remembered the bitter leaves they had rolled in Africa and called tobacco out of politeness. He remembered the way tobacco had become currency, diplomacy, mercy. Here, it was a ration, a habit, an afterthought. That night the barracks filled with the plush, blue smell of smoke that didn't need to be hoarded. Men leaned back on their bunks and let the ceiling take their exhale. Talk turned, careful at first, then more frank, to what the senses had reported all day. The electricity that did not falter. The bread whose weight you didn't need to guess. The guards' casual, unstaged decency. For a long time, Wilhelm let them talk while he listened to the hum of the bulb, the creak of bunk slats settling, the shallow murmur of a country at war that knew how to make plenty. He closed the diary and imagined the map again, Europe shrunken to a series of underlined shortages. He thought of a line Vogel had spoken at the rail yard, the sound of a war decided on tracks. He added, privately, another line. And in kitchens. The ease of this abundance frightened him more than any weapon he knew. If a nation could feed prisoners like this without flinching, what did it give its soldiers? He turned onto his side and tucked the diary under his pillow like a contraband talisman. Outside, somewhere in the dark, a windmill clicked and turned, patient as a metronome, keeping time for a war that would not pause just because a handful of men had eaten well. In the bunk above him, a corporal from Munich whispered into his blanket, "It's a trick." No one answered. The room settled. The light hummed. Wilhelm watched smoke dissolve in it, and tried to calculate how many cigarettes you would need to measure a nation that could make neon signs glow in wartime. He fell asleep with the arithmetic unfinished, the embers afterimage, resting behind his eyelids, like a second, doubtful Sunday. The truck's engine coughed against the autumn chill, carrying Wilhelm Krauss and a dozen others through the quiet Iowa night. They were told it was work detail near a town called Des Moines. The prisoners expected fields or fences, another circle of wire, another endless repetition of labor. Instead, what revealed itself under the rolling dark was a city alive with light. Neon signs, bold and unashamed, pulsed over shop fronts. Theaters spilled glow like open furnaces. Street lamps stood unblinking at every corner. Wilhelm's jaw clenched as he realized this was no show for their benefit. This was ordinary life, displayed without apology. He remembered Berlin's choking darkness, the blackout curtains, the Gestapo's punishments for even a candle left unshaded. Yet here, wartime streets glowed brighter than Unter den Linden ever had in peace. Vogel's muttered words cut across the truck's rattle. If they waste electricity on signs, how much do they keep for their war? No answer followed. Silence was safer than despair. Numbers would later confirm what Wilhelm already sensed. The United States generated over 140 billion kilowatt-hours of electricity in 1944, more than Germany and all its conquered territories combined. In that moment, staring out from the slatted truck, Wilhelm felt the unseen heartbeat of a power grid, vast enough to flood an entire continent with light. It wasn't a military parade or propaganda film. It was the glow of grocery stores and cinemas, ordinary citizens walking without fear. That was its sharpest edge. The casualness of abundance. The next morning they were marched into an industrial complex that seemed less factory than continent of steel. Willow Run, Michigan, the bomber plant that Henry Ford's empire had carved out of farmland, throbbed like a machine cathedral. Wilhelm had seen factories before. Dingy shops in Stuttgart, half-ruined plants in Bremen. Nothing like this. One roof contained miles of conveyor belts, cranes, swinging fuselages, as if they were toys, women in overalls fastening rivets with precision that rivaled drill sergeants. The thunder of presses shook his bones. The figure, spoken casually by a guard, staggered the imagination. 1 B-24 bomber, every 63 minutes. Vogel leaned close, his face pale under the skylights. This single hall builds more in a day than Germany in a month. He didn't need to be told the statistics. Germany's aircraft industry crippled by shortages, aluminum stripped from church bells, factories shattered by Allied raids. Here, industry moved with a rhythm that suggested not strain but inevitability. War as routine. Wilhelm felt the smoke of his lucky strike sting his lungs, and, in its ember, he saw something Berlin had never admitted. They were fighting a nation whose factories could drown them in machines faster than they could resist. That evening, in the barracks, the men's talk grew uneven. A corporal from Munich clung to denial. It is only one plant for display. But no one argued loudly. They had seen the rail yards, the glowing towns, the endless fields of coal. It was a pattern too large to ignore. Wilhelm lay back, smoke curling above his bunk, and thought of Rommel's reports from Africa. Fuel shortages. Spare parts scavenged like bones. In contrast, America was not starving its prisoners. It was feeding them pie. If they could waste strength here, what did they wield at the front? The rail journey westward carried the next revelation. Through narrow carriage windows, the land unfurled without boundary. Iowa's fields stretched to horizons Wilhelm's European eyes had no language for. He had grown among vineyards hemmed by hills, fields measured in hectares. Here, the plains rolled in miles, oceans of corn and wheat swaying under a sun that seemed complicit in America's power. Department of Agriculture figures confirmed what the eye already told. Iowa alone harvested 500 million bushels of corn in 1944, more than entire German provinces combined. Wilhelm pressed his forehead to the glass, whispering, "One farm here could feed my whole village." His voice carried neither envy nor admiration, only the weight of recognition. Vogel sat beside him, silent. V. Reich had praised peasant virtue, blood rooted in sacred soil, but here, one farmer with a tractor did the work of dozens with horses. Machines roared across fields, steel teeth tearing furrows wider than vineyards. It was not superiority of spirit, it was superiority of scale. At the worksite, a farmer named John Whittaker greeted them. He owned over 1,000 acres, land so vast Wilhelm mistook it for a township. Whittaker spoke little, but his tractors spoke enough. John Deere engines, immense and gleaming, pulled rows of plows through soil dark as coffee. The Germans were handed tools to help with harvest, but it was obvious they were ornaments beside machines. For Vogel, once proud of his lectures on German peasant tradition, it was humiliation. He muttered as he wiped sweat from his brow. If this is one man's farm, how do we fight an empire of them? At noon, Whittaker's wife arrived with pails of cold milk, her children following like ducklings. The prisoners froze, uncertain if this was theater, if kindness could be weapon. But thirst proved stronger. The milk was thick, sweet, alive with cream. The farmer's children watched without fear, their laughter rising like skylarks. Wilhelm drank and thought of his sister in Stuttgart, her skin pale from rationing, her milk watered until it was barely white. The taste cut him more sharply than any whip. For the first time in years, he felt full and guilty for it. That night in the barracks, soil still clinging to their boots, the prisoners whispered. A single American barn held more grain than a German silo. One herd of cattle outnumbered villages back home. Statistics later gathered confirmed their impressions. 8 million tractors in American fields, compared to Germany's 200,000 most already seized for the Wehrmacht. A diary entry later found in Wilhelm's hand summed it. They told us, our soil was sacred. Yet these machines harvest more in an hour than our families in a season. What meaning is left in superiority if your children starve? The men carried those questions into their dreams. Propaganda had armored them with slogans of destiny and strength. The plains, the barns, the milk pails had pierced it in a single day. Wilhelm closed his eyes that night and saw. Not swastikas or slogans, but the farmers' children laughing in the Sunday. It unsettled him more than the Willow Run plant, more than the glowing cities. For war was meant to harden men. Instead, here, in the enemy's fields, it made them wonder if kindness itself was America's most dangerous weapon. Late autumn crept into the fields, painting the corn stubble gold, and the barns a darker red. By then, Wilhelm Krauss had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the Midwest. Dawn roll call, a guarded truck ride to John Whitaker's farm. Hours spent dragging sacks or repairing fences under a sun that seemed eternal. Yet nothing prepared him for the day. Whitaker arrived at the camp gates with an unthinkable request. He wished to invite several prisoners into his home for supper. The guards hesitated. Rules allowed for limited civilian interaction, but this was different. Whitaker was insistent, and perhaps the war in Iowa felt far enough away from the front lines that compassion could risk a test. That evening, Wilhelm, Vogel, and 3 others walked across the dusky fields, their boots scuffing against frost-kissed grass. Barbed wire receded behind them, and for the first time since capture, they walked unshackled toward a stranger's open door. The farmhouse glowed like a lantern in the falling dark. Smoke rose from the chimney, fragrant with wood and roast meat. To men who had braced themselves for execution upon capture, the idea of sitting at a civilian's table was almost unbearable in its strangeness. Inside, Margaret Whitaker moved quietly between stove and table, her children peeking from the staircase, their eyes wide but unafraid. The long table groaned with food roast, chicken, bowls of potatoes, beans slick with butter, loaves steaming as if pulled from the oven only minutes before. The prisoners hesitated, hands hovering above plates, uncertain whether to touch this miracle. Whitaker gestured simply, "Eat." The guards at the door nodded. Vogel reached first, lifting his fork with a reverence he had never given the Reich's banners. The chicken was tender, the bread warm. Wilhelm chewed slowly, waiting for the illusion to dissolve. But it didn't. He had not eaten like this since before the war, before ration books and thin cabbage soup. The taste of butter on his tongue was more shocking than a rifle's report. Conversation stumbled at first, fragments of English some prisoners knew, gestures where words failed. Whitaker asked about villages, families. One man slid a creased photograph of his fiancée across the table. Margaret leaned in, nodding with genuine warmth. No speeches, no politics. Only the clink of forks, the shy laughter of children emboldened enough to approach. For Vogel, a history teacher before the war, the ordinariness was unbearable. When Margaret set before him a slice of apple pie, fragrant with cinnamon, he whispered hoarsely, "How can we hate those who share their bread with us?" Wilhelm felt the sting of his sister's absence more keenly than ever. The farmer's son, no older than she, offered him a piece of pie with an earnest grin. Wilhelm accepted, biting into sweetness he thought lost to memory. In that moment, the war seemed impossibly far away. The Reich's shrill speeches about American chaos and corruption clattered to pieces in his mind, undone by a family meal. He found himself studying the farmer's children, their cheeks round with health, their laughter ringing against the walls. This, he realized, was victory, in its quietest form, not bombers or tanks, but the ability to live without fear, to feed strangers without pause. When the meal ended, the prisoners rose, reluctantly. Whitaker shook each man's hand firmly, his eyes steady, saying nothing of politics. The gesture carried more weight than any proclamation. As Wilhelm stepped back through the camp gates under guard, he composed words silently, to be carved into his diary later. "We entered expecting death. We left having tasted life." In the barracks that night, silence hung heavy. Some men scribbled in diaries, others stared at bunks above them, cigarettes glowing like scattered embers. Wilhelm wrote furiously, as if afraid memory might fade. "They told us Americans were mongrels, incapable of culture. Yet I saw a family give us meat and pie while their sons fight abroad. If they can spare this kindness for enemies, what lies behind their armies?" His pen scratched hard enough to tear the paper. The danger was not the food, nor the pie, nor the milk. The danger was what such kindness did to certainty. The Reich had promised them a vision of superiority carved in blood and soil. Yet here, In a stranger's kitchen, superiority seemed hollow. One farmer's meal threatened to unravel years of indoctrination more thoroughly than any Allied bomb. Vogel said it aloud as the barracks dimmed for lights out. What defense does an idea have when your enemy offers you bread instead of bullets? No one answered. But Wilhelm lay awake, the taste of cinnamon still on his tongue, wondering whether the Reich's true weakness had been exposed not on battlefields, but at a table in Iowa. And still, deeper revelations loomed. In the weeks that followed, evidence piled higher than any diary could hold. Newspapers allowed in camp spoke of Liberty ships launched every 4 days, of U-boats destroyed faster than they could be built. Red Cross bulletins revealed that America sent 17 million tons of food overseas in 1944 alone, feeding not only its own armies, but allies across 3 continents. For Vogel, such numbers were more crushing than artillery. If a nation feeds half the world and still offers pie to its prisoners, he muttered at roll call, what Reich remains? The question hung like smoke above their heads, heavy, undeniable. By the winter of 1944, the air in the barracks was thick with smoke, ink, and questions no one dared voice too loudly. Cigarettes glowed in the dark like watchful eyes. Diaries filled with secret lines that would one day slip back into Germany testaments, not of executions or starvation, but of roast chicken, milk, neon signs, and factories that seemed to stretch to the horizon. The war was still raging, and yet, inside the wire, doubt was spreading faster than barbed rumors could contain. December brought snow to Iowa, laying a white hush across the camp. Guards permitted a modest celebration for Christmas. Extra rations arrived, oranges, chocolate, coffee, even carols sung without reprimand. For Wilhelm Krauss, standing among men whose voices rose in both German and English, the moment cut deeper than any statistic. He remembered Stuttgart's Christmas under blackout, the air raid sirens wailing louder than hymns, the smell of damp basements, children pressing ration cards into their parents' hands. Here, even behind wire, there was warmth, light, and a strange, almost unbearable peace. The Reich had taught them to believe that strength lay in iron, in blood, in sacrifice. But what they witnessed here suggested something far more unsettling. Strength lay in the ability to live as if war did not consume every breath. America built bombers at Willow Run, while its citizens danced at Saturday cinemas. It lit its towns without fear, shipped millions of tons of grain abroad, and still placed apple pie before its prisoners. For men like Wilhelm, this realization was corrosive. Ideology thrived on deprivation and struggle. It faltered in the face of abundance. Otto Vogel, always the teacher, began phrasing his doubts in quiet lessons. At roll call, he leaned toward Wilhelm and whispered, "Our leaders told us America was chaos. Then who builds the machines that blacken the skies? Who feeds half the world while their soldiers march forward? Not us." Not anymore. His words carried no bitterness, only weary clarity. Some nodded. Others refused to listen, clinging to the idea that it was all illusion, a trick for their eyes only. But denial grew brittle when day after day the evidence mounted. Trainloads of coal, shipyards spitting out vessels, farmers feeding them milk, as if from an endless well. The guards seemed to understand the silent war unfolding in the prisoners' minds. They rarely lectured, never paraded their country's power. They didn't need to. Every glowing street, every loaf of bread, every packet of Lucky Strikes, spoke louder than any speech. Propaganda unraveled not with shouting, but with ordinary proof. The kind that lodged in a man's stomach and would not leave. As 1945 drew closer, Wilhelm's diary thickened. He wrote not in the cadence of a soldier, but in the tone of a witness. They told us America was a mongrel nation. Yet I saw farmers who feed us while their sons fight abroad. They told us they were weak. Yet I have seen machines so many that I cannot count them, barns so full they bend at the seams, and children who laugh at us without fear. If this is weakness, then what does strength look like? His hand trembled as he wrote, not from cold, but from the enormity of it all. He knew the words, if ever read back home, would sound like betrayal. And yet, to deny them, felt impossible. Others confessed their turmoil only in muttered fragments. "What will happen when we return?" a corporal asked one night. "What will we tell our children, that America was a lie, or that everything we believed was?" The barracks fell silent. No one had an answer. The war had not ended, but for these men, something inside already had. The true devastation was not the prison camp's fences, nor the weight of defeat on the battlefield. It was the knowledge that ordinary life in America, its tractors, its barns, its pies cooling on farmhouse windowsills, was stronger than the Reich's grandiose promises. The discovery gnawed at them slowly, night after night, until belief itself felt like the most fragile thing they possessed. When Christmas carols drifted into the frozen night, Wilhelm closed his eyes and saw not the Reich's banners but the Whitakers' dinner table. He heard laughter, smelled cinnamon, remembered the boy's earnest smile as he offered him a slice of pie. That memory, more than any battlefield loss, would follow him home like a shadow. For in that moment, he had glimpsed something no bullet could destroy, the idea that strength lay not in fear or conquest, but in the quiet power of abundance and kindness. The Reich's iron armor had cracked, and through it seeped something far more enduring than victory or defeat, a truth that no barbed wire could contain. When spring returned in 1945, the war was grinding toward its violent climax across Europe. But in Iowa, the rhythms of American life pulsed on, steady as ever. Liberty ships still rolled from shipyards every few days. Factories still shook the earth with the thunder of presses. Corn still grew in straight, endless rows, as though the land itself refused to acknowledge war. For the prisoners inside the barbed wire fences, each ordinary sight became another chisel strike against the stone walls of belief they had carried from Germany. Newspapers were permitted inside the camp, folded and dog-eared, their ink smudging the fingertips of men who had once read only state-approved propaganda. The headlines confirmed what their own eyes already suspected: U-boats lost faster than they could be built, Allied armies advancing on every front, American aid feeding not only its own soldiers but millions across Britain, France, and even the Soviet Union. 17 million tons of food shipped overseas in a single year. The numbers were impossible to reconcile with the Reich's portrait of a collapsing, decadent enemy. Sergeant Vogel read aloud one evening, his voice brittle with disbelief. "If a nation can feed half the world and still give us pie, then what Reich remains?" No one answered him, because no answer could survive the question. Wilhelm wrote in his diary, with the urgency of a man afraid the truth might vanish if not captured in ink. "Strength does not lie in terror or domination," he scrawled under the flicker of the barracks bulb. "It lies in the ability to feed millions, to light cities in war, to extend a hand instead of a rifle." His words felt treasonous, yet more honest than anything he had spoken since donning a uniform. He pressed the pencil so hard that the paper tore, as if the conviction itself demanded to be carved into permanence. The guards noticed the prisoner's changing mood, but did little to intervene. Perhaps they understood that ideology eroded faster under the weight of lived evidence than under lectures or punishment. Every glass of cold milk, every neon sign glowing in the dark, every lucky strike casually passed into calloused German hands was a lesson sharper than propaganda. The Americans didn't need to argue superiority. They simply lived it, in ways impossible to disguise. By December of that year, the camp had become a strange world unto itself. German voices sang alongside American carols, not in harmony, not quite, but in something close. Cigarette smoke curled upward as men clutched chocolate, oranges, and small tokens allowed for the holiday. Wilhelm stood in the snow, listening as the voices rose, and thought of Stuttgart's shattered streets, its children shivering in cellars. He felt the bitter contrast of two worlds, one devoured by war, the other powerful enough to pretend, for a night, that war had not swallowed everything. In the end, it was not the bombs that broke the faith of men like Wilhelm, nor even the overwhelming weight of military defeat. It was the collision between ideology and ordinary American life. To see barns larger than German towns, children who laughed without hunger, women riveting bombers in factories that never slept, and families who could invite enemies to supper, this was devastation of another kind. It hollowed out certainty, left men staring at their own reflections in the dark, unable to summon hatred with the same vigor as before. When the war finally ended and the gates opened for repatriation, many prisoners carried more than their duffel bags. They carried notebooks inked with doubts, images of pie and milk, memories of neon light against winter snow. Some would bury those memories out of fear when they returned to a Germany demanding loyalty even in ruin. Others would keep them alive, sharing whispers of what they had seen, stories of America's factories, its farms, and its kindness. And for Wilhelm, the lesson hardened into something unshakable. The Reich had tried to command loyalty through fear, but America had conquered his imagination through abundance. He boarded the train that would carry him back across the ocean, diary tucked into his coat, the words etched there burning brighter than any speech he had ever heard. The war was over. But in Wilhelm's mind, the true victory was already decided long before the surrender papers were signed, decided in a farmhouse, where an enemy farmer passed him bread, and in a land where lights never went dark.